When a Jordanian fighter pilot was burned alive in a cage by ISIL, many in the Arab world reacted with outrage and condemnation. Jordan vowed to avenge his death and has since launched a series of military strikes against ISIL targets. Could this be a turning point in the war against the militant Islamic group that now controls major parts of Iraq and Syria? Several Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq and Jordan, are already part of a US-led coalition fighting ISIL. But does the conflict require more than just a military response? Should Arab states take the lead and play a central role in helping to defeat ISIL, or is it already too late? Joining me now from Amman, Jordan, Mamoun Abu Nawar. He is a former Jordanian Air Force general. He's also a political and military analyst. With me here in the studio is Tawfiq Hamid. He is a former extremist from Egypt and is now an Islamic thinker and reformer. And also with us is Phyllis Bennis. She is a writer and longtime analyst on Middle East issues. She directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Let's start off in Jordan. Mamoun Abu Nawar, the execution of that captured Jordanian pilot, as I've said, generated a great deal of outrage and anger in the Arab world. Is this a turning point in the fight against ISIL?
Yes, Jordan retaliate with no emotion. It's a punishment for them, and now Jordan is the central of the campaign, air campaign, I could say. There is so many alliance over there. We got Emiratis, the American, and the French. So it is it's sort of getting the leadership of the region and saying that we need a lot of resources to carry on with our mission. The air campaign, I think, is going in the right direction, but slow, very slow on achieving things on the ground. I could say if we need to escalate or to increase the sortie rate to get the proper result on the ground. Having said that, we need also some ground troops to have a better result. So I'm not sure if the Arabs want to do that or to go on land campaign at the moment. Therefore, I think American could help on that by sending more troops, I think, like 15,000 or so, specialized on targetees, advisor, planners, things like that, to change things on the ground. Also, if you want to defeat ISIL, you should defeat them on Syria, on Raqqa area. And the participation of the Arabs on a ground campaign is a must to defeat ISIS. Also, I think Jordan should ask now from the American more support, especially the RBVs, unmanned pilot vehicles, because it does play a greater role on that part of the world, and especially on signature strike against group or on personalized strike against leadership. There is another point I'd like to mention, that Iran is playing a great influence on the planning and execution of these missions, as if the Arab they're under command, and there is some sort of Shia jihad sort of which promote the sphere of influence of Iran in the region, and that got to be stopped in a way or about. Otherwise, Jordan also should ask also for political reforms from the Iraqi. It must be a conditional things, because otherwise we're going to go on a very long attrition war.
All right, Phyllis, is there an appetite in the region and indeed in the United States for a wider war and expanding conflict?
I'm not sure that's the right question. I don't think the issue is there an appetite? There should never be an appetite for war. I think in this case, the war is making things worse and not better. I don't think that there is an instant solution to the huge accomplishments that ISIS has managed to do in this last year, where they have taken over huge swaths of territory, a hellish life for the people living under their rule. That's certainly true. But the question is military strikes the way to go? And I would say no. What we see is that every time, for example, if you look in Iraq, every time there's a strike on an ISIS target, or allegedly on an ISIS target, we don't really know who's being killed, what we hear here is, yay, we got the bad guys. What we hear there from many Iraqi Sunnis, certainly not all, but many, is there it is again. The US is bombing Sunni targets, the hospital in Fallujah that was bombed, etc., is bombing Sunnis in the interest of Kurds and Shia. And that's not going to work. The point that we just heard at the very end needs to be the first point, which is there needs to be political change inside Iraq, and globally and in the region, ending the war in Syria is the critical factor in defeating ISIS.
Well, there probably needs to be political change in other countries in the Middle East as well.
Absolutely. The question of Saudi Arabia, where the ideology of ISIS comes directly from Saudi Wahhabism. In Jordan, I mean, Jordan, whatever role it's playing, has a history of its mukhabarat being very repressive against the population, anyone who dares dissent, let alone what's happening in Bahrain, where people are losing their citizenship, in Egypt, in all of these countries. It's a disaster in terms of human rights of ordinary people. And that, of course, is feeding the frenzy of civil war in Syria. But there is a global and regional question that must be addressed here. And the issue of Iran has to be involved, Russia has to be involved, the US, the UAE, Jordan, Turkey, all of the countries that are now involved in fighting a proxy war in Syria. This is making it worse. And as long as that war goes forward, the existence of ISIL will continue, and the capacity of ISIS to gain new weapons. Because every time weapons are sent to the so-called moderate opposition, they end up in the hands of ISIS, because right now ISIS are better fighters, better armed, more money, and stronger. So this is not going to work. We have to get out of the mode of saying, if we need to do something, it must be military. There is never only the choice of military or nothing. We have to look at all the alternatives first. We don't start with the military. And when we do go to the military, all of the other alternatives get taken right off the table.
Tawfiq, if we look at the response in Jordan, can Jordan take on ISIL on its own? Does it have the resources? And does it risk a backlash from its own population?
It certainly risks a backlash, but not from its own population, from the ISIS people themselves, because the population in Jordan are turning against ISIL very strongly. And you can't imagine what they are doing. They are burning, actually, the ideological books that promote this ideology in the streets.
But we're hearing that there is opposition to what the king is doing.
It's very small.
From a part of Jordan.
From one tribe.
Yes,
from one tribe initially. And yeah. I think this was at the very initial, like, few hours of the situation, or one day. But when the king himself returned back and started to lead the war, or whatever you will call it, against ISIS or ISIL, this problem settled. So this was just at the very initial stage of the problem, but I don't see now anything but unity on the Jordanian street with the king to fight this evil. So I feel this can be a turning point here. But when it comes to defeating ISIL, really, or ISIS, you need three basic things. You need an immediate plan. You need to support the forces on ground that have real interest in defeating ISIS immediately as they could. And you have to have a long-term plan. The long-term plan is through reformation, education, and changing the interpretations of the radical texts. And I see President Al-Sisi really was in Egypt, is leading on this. He spoke clearly to the religious scholars, telling them you have to reform the understanding of this violent text and bring something different. So he's taking a lead here, and this needs to happen. The second is to support the ground forces of those parties who have real interest in defeating ISIS, including Jordan today and the Kurds. They are fierce fighters. It's a matter of life and death for them. And also they showed evidence of success in Kobani when they got it back from the ISIS people. Okay. But the most important, in my view, the most important factor is to launch an effective PSYOP operation, psychological warfare against this group, because wars in history never ended until one of the groups uses effective psychological deterrent.
Okay, if I can get an answer very quickly, because I'm going to go back to Jordan. But you were saying a military campaign first, then we address the socio-economic political issues. That's the opposite of what Phyllis was saying.
Yes, it could be the opposite, but with the military campaign, you need to make it effective an effective psychological warfare operation running parallel to this military campaign. Otherwise, it will be useless, it will be ineffective at the end, or at least ineffective.
All right, let's go back to Jordan, to Mamoun Abu Nawar. Mamoun, what can you tell us about Jordan's resolve to take this fight to ISIL? The king is threatening what he called a relentless war against them.
Yes, absolutely, but we need the resources to do that. I think if we stay like this war is going to be a long way. These people, they have no country, no border, no limit, and there is no absolute security. You can't get absolute security for all border in the region, even the whole world, so it's everybody will get to go on. Now, if you want to carry on such a war, you need resources. I'd say again, Jordan must have resources from the US and from the regional partner also to carry on its mission. We need immediate $1 billion sort of. This campaign will cost Jordan like $8 billion if he stayed and carry on this. We need spare parts. We need the smart bombs. We need all kind of things to carry on our mission. And I think moving the Emirates planes down to Jordan, that will respond very quick to the theater demand, opportunity target, and will hit their command control, and they will restrict their movement. So it does have an effect there, power. I could say up to 70%, but really we should have a massive air campaign. I could say like it could affect the world 70% or so, and we need, in addition to that, the ground troop. And as I've said earlier, you need to defeat them in Raqqa and Syria before, just push them out of Iraq.
Okay.
And that's would take a very long time. Mosul also, it's a very hard target. There is some very hard target to get back. Training the 9th Brigade from the Iraqi or 12 and to come back, and I don't think they are ready for that. These are sectarian army, and the Sunni sect, they don't trust them, especially the Hashd al-Shabi and all of that.
So
you got all Iranian influence through.
Let me get a response from Phyllis here. Another voice advocating a military solution.
Yeah, and the problem is, I'm trying to imagine a massive bombing campaign in Raqqa or in Mosul. These are huge cities with 1 million people, more than 1 million people in Mosul, 800,000, I think, still in Raqqa. The massive number of casualties, number one, at the human level, would be just horrifying to imagine. There is no way to carry out a major bombing raid in cities without massive numbers of civilian casualties. So the first level is the people who are killed, the families that are destroyed. The second question is, then what does that do to people's psychology, if you will? It turns them against, appropriately, those who have been bombing them. You know, it's an astonishing thing to hear this from military leaders, I must say, because military leaders should understand the consequences of military actions. That's why we have to stop talking about military solutions and start looking at issues of ceasefires, as the UN is trying to do in Syria. Eventually, when that ceasefire becomes broader, we start looking at arms embargoes, cutting off the arms supplies. That means, yes, we have to deal with Iran and Russia, but the only way that's going to happen is when the US stops providing new weapons, new bombs, new billion-dollar arms sales to Jordan, to Turkey, to any of these other countries. You know, the fact that a Jordanian bomber pilot was shot down and killed in this horrific way, it was a horror at the human level. But this was a bomber pilot. This was not just some ordinary person. So making a political, and in this case, military campaign based on the death of a bomber pilot, to me, I'm not a military strategist. I'm an anti-military strategist, perhaps. But for anyone in the military to build a new strategy based on the killing of a bomber pilot, to me, sounds absolutely backwards in terms of understanding what the priorities are and what the consequences are going to be.
Tawfiq?
I see there is a place here for some middle solution, because I see one of the views from Jordan is advocating basically military bombing and intervention. And she is, on the contrary, believing in the opposite. So there is something in the middle, which I really I meant when I said military intervention. I didn't mean traditional military intervention at all. I didn't mean just the basic bombing that happened in Afghanistan and in Iraq before, and it didn't work, and radical Islam is on the rise. I meant interventions of the kind of operations, of the special operations, like what happened to bin Laden, for example. Specific targets, you kidnap them, you assassinate them, you kidnap them, and use psychological factors with this process. So military intervention, certainly you need some military with people who carry weapons against you. But the way the military operations is conducted shouldn't follow traditional approach of just bombing and bombing, because these people, as she said, are distributed everywhere. You can't just bomb everyone unless this is your intention. That's another issue. But you need a typical military approach, non-traditional approach that uses specific operations, small operations led by intelligence, coupled with PSYOP operations together. They can be very efficient in these types of war.
Okay, we are going to have to take a short break right now. When we come back, more on ISIL and the role of Arab states in stopping the militant group. You're watching The Heat.